Welcome to Biocomputation with Max. Today is Wednesday, June 25th, and I want to briefly touch on the news before diving into some deeper analysis. This show is presented as a podcast as I try to explore different formats in order to expedite publication, but hopefully still deliver important and relevant analysis. The news is that President Trump has apparently managed a remarkable win, securing a ceasefire between Iran and Israel, which has held so far despite some violations that made him drop some F-bombs when asked for comment. This is great news indeed. Let's hope that this peace lasts. However, the way we got here is also highly problematic and consequential. Even if this works, it is a case of ends justify the means, also known as might makes right. It impacts conflict resolution globally and has a corrosive internal effect. USA was founded as a republic, if you can keep it. But it has imperial tendencies. In fact, like Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, there are two faces. Now, I have to explain why I delve into this painful subject. First, I consider myself to be an American by choice, as opposed to by birth. Almost 30 years ago, I became a naturalized citizen and had to swear allegiance to the flag and to the republic for which it stands. I take it seriously. I swore the allegiance to the republic, not to the empire. Second, I have some personal experience with fall of an empire, specifically USSR, and this informs me. And so I want to share insights from that experience so together we can avoid these problems. As I described the US situation in the previous video, we're in a period that can be called Trump's perestroika. The original perestroika led by Michael Gorbachev in a decade resulted in a decade of troubles for Russia amidst this economic restructuring. There's no reason to think that the US cannot go through a similar period, especially as our debt skyrockets. We're certainly not immune to those effects, and that could be enough to cause a collapse of social contract as we know it. Now, debt has deep connections to the US empire because of foreign spending on military conflicts. In many ways, we effectively inherited the British Empire. It started with a push for freedom in a new land and developed into an attitude of exceptionalism, which is an emotional gateway to the empire. So let us briefly review the situation of American lands. Americans fought the British and the French for the East Coast. We purchased Louisiana from Napoleon's France, fought Mexicans for California and absorbed Texas, bought Alaska from the Russian Empire. During the Civil War, the primary objective of the North in the first 2 years was preservation of the Union, not freeing the slaves. After successfully winning the Civil War, US was able to drive west, what was called manifest destiny, as US settlers displaced Native Americans. After winning the Spanish-American War in 1898, the US picked up additional pieces of their empire, Guam, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines. At the same time, we annexed Hawaii after a coup d'etat that was orchestrated by a group of American and European businessmen who established a provisional government, which quickly presented annexation requests to the US, which US generously accepted. Around the same time, US acquired American Samoa from willing local chiefs. We purchased Virgin Islands from Denmark in 1917, at least some part. The British purchased the rest. It took the US until the end of the 20th century to get the Spanish-owned Northern Mariana Islands. And of course, this year, Trump offered to buy Greenland. So our passion for land expansion is all well and good, notwithstanding the fact that Philippines was surrendered as well as other areas. Our attitude also reminds one of the empire. Statistics bear it out. One study suggests that at least 72 attempts at regime change were made by US between 1947 and 1989. That's according to Washington Post. This is likely a serious undercount, but that's still already a very impressive tally. It includes the 1953 CIA coup in Iran to return the unpopular Shah who fled the country. Of course, he stayed in power until removed by the Islamic Revolution in 1979, which brings us to the problems of this day. Quite recently, the United States has attempted many color revolutions and regime changes, from Arab Spring that laid the foundation for the destructions of Libya and Syria, to overturning of Egypt's pharaonic ruler for a decade, Hosni Mubarak. They're everywhere. The United States also led color velvet revolutions in Georgia and Ukraine, propelling both into conflicts of Russia. In fact, it was acknowledged that Georgia started the conflict with Russia in 2008, which came as a shock to me. More recently, of course, the US became involved in the Israel-Iran war. Now, we have to give Trump credit for putting an early stop to that war after 12 days of fighting. And we can be optimistic that this will stay. However, there are at least three major reservations about this approach to peace through strength. They are lack of control of the conflict and unpredictable consequences, closing the door on politics, and the potential for continued deception. So let's delve deeper into that. So first, the loss of control. Trump was risking a longer and more serious conflict. It was up to Iran to pull back and to Israel to a large extent. And Trump, as I mentioned, had to drop an F-bomb because it's difficult to separate them. Now, there's talk about a military victory delivered by US, but ultimately it was the restraint of Iran that allowed us to achieve this. So perhaps we should also focus on that and allow that to be celebrated. Of course, Iran was left with few good options. And in my previous video, I pointed out that the typical responses were effectively cut off. Their proxies, mainly the Hezbollah, have been defeated. Attacks on US could lead to serious escalation and regime change. Closing the Straits of Hormuz would hurt them more than anyone. And of course, one of their biggest supporters, China, which, as I mentioned, imports 90% of Iranian crude and some 16%, 1/6 of China's oil also comes from, seaborne oil comes from Iran. Now, Trump, of course, dropped the F-bomb on the subject as after the real bombs, which reveals the challenge of controlling the situation, the unpredictability of war that has started, and that there are other choices made by the countries. This is the analogy of the moves in the grand chessboard, where both Israel and Iran get to make their choices and their moves. Neither can be fully controlled or cajoled by the US, and we risk an unpredictable ending. The second problem is that attack on Iran is that we sacrificed our moral superiority and the clarity of our position, especially as some kind of an arbiter. Of course, we like the terminology of a rules-based order, but how is that to be maintained if we're setting an example of resolving a conflict with ends justifying the means? How do we oppose the force used by Hamas against Israel on October 7th, 2023, or the Russian special military operation? Can the rights of Palestinians in Gaza and Russian speakers in Donbass be also respected? In both cases, there are grievances with a large number of people that find their situations intolerable and may be ready to use force. And so we're opening Pandora's box. Of course, this is one of the grave consequences of October 7th, is that this actually closed the door to a resolution, which I think was ultimately what was desired for this attack, to reinitiate the political process through these barbaric means. Similar, the attack on the Hindus in Kashmir earlier this year was to serve a political goal. And we reject that way of doing business. So how can we then justify these preemptive attacks? So of course, this is how in the future we may come to regret our choices. This could indeed backfire. Finally, Brookings Institute laid out the path to Persia in its publication from 2009, and we appear to have executed two of the three options, just short of invasion, of the military strikes. And now we're approaching the third part, toppling Tehran, regime change. That's a very clear title of part 3 of this book. There are three options, and once again, one of them we will not pursue, but we could pursue the other two simultaneously: a popular uprising and insurgency by ethnic minorities. So, in other words, the playbook says that the confrontation with Iran could switch to covert mode for regime change. How would Iran politically react to this foment of internal unrest? Would it lead to renewed military conflict? So there's a possibility that if they feel cornered, that not only did we destroy the military capacity, but now we're going for the regime change after all, this could also lead to unpredictable consequences. So even if President Trump succeeds in his gamble of peaceful strength with Iraq, it will demonstrate what I called return to arms in my previous video, which is the ends justify the means, might makes right. This opened the door for violent resolutions to all kinds of conflicts in Gaza, Ukraine, Kashmir. Now, how could we argue against a preemptive strike by another country now? And how can we distinguish proper defense in the form of offense is the best defense from offense that simply works? So this moral dilemma is going to remain with us for years, but the ceasefire may not last long. So in summary, I offer three main observations. Trump succeeded brilliantly for now, but that is in part due to Iran's cooperation, however coerced. Second, there's no guarantee that the US has fully and truly abandoned its goals for the regime change, and that could jeopardize the détente with Iran. So peace may not last. Third, conflicts are expensive, and the US is providing arms to Ukraine and may want to start something with China. And we've already seen limitations of aerial interceptors. Now, there is a NATO summit now underway, and members just confirmed an increase of defense and security spending to 5% of GDP by 2035. This includes 3.5% for so-called hard defense, tanks, bombs, military hardware of all other sorts, and 1.5% for border security, cyber threats, and military mobility. So in terms of overall GDP of the EU, this 5% NATO benchmark would mean 3.4% of EU's GDP. The current level of spending is 1.3%. That means 260% increase. Meanwhile, the investment gap, 260% increase, also 2.1% of GDP, which happens to be on the low end of the investment gap for meeting EU social and green initiatives, climate mitigation, healthcare, and housing. And that's estimated to be 2.1 to 2.9% of the GDP. It's literally an either-or option, especially because they don't have the luxury of reserve currency as we do in the United States. In other words, the EU would literally have to give up its green and social goals to prioritize the military goals. Meanwhile, their population is aging and their energy prices are skyrocketing. What about the United States? Trump tried to get hundreds of billions back from Zelensky, but settled for a contract for minerals, which would require years to develop and billions to access, and many of which anyway lie on the territory controlled by the Russian Federation. So on the subject of money, we spend about $1 trillion on the military. Last year was 997 billion. And there is an expectation of return on investment. Unfortunately, we've been unable to win wars for quite some time, and perhaps we've found a new way, or at least our leaders have found the new ways to monetize these conflicts, taxing their own people. That makes sense because empires are expensive and eventually you run out of other people's money. So this happens when an empire consumes more resources than it produces. This is a natural inflection point of militarization, and it appears that we've reached that point here in the United States. The real question is whether the US empire will take down the US Republic. The common denominator here is money and military, of course, but I want to focus on the financial aspect. United States, like the EU, can choose to spend a lot on its military, and that's a money pit of public resources because it's not returning productively to the economy. Alternatively, we can choose in the productive private economy and build up our society. Our financial situation doesn't allow us to do it all either, despite having the world's reserve currency. And that's because the servicing of our debt is already also exceeding 1.1 trillion. In fact, it's something like 1.2 trillion for the last fiscal year. It's certainly greater than the Pentagon budget, which is the largest department. So as we spend on bringing microchips to the United States and other massive investments, we're digging a deeper financial hole. Of course, merely printing money to finance both military and technical innovation would cause our debt to explode further. In my first video since restarting this channel this year, I asked whether the national debt under Trump could reach 50 trillion by the end of his second term. We're now at 37 trillion, and the Build Back Better, the Big Beautiful Build, the BBB gets confusing, is adding 5 trillion to the deficit. And we have 2 trillion annual deficits already. So we're on the way. Needless to say, these massive deficits drive up inflation that impacts the quality of life, especially for the less affluent. And of course, this vast spending on interest becomes a vicious cycle. I will talk about Jerome Powell and the Fed in the future victory. Suffice it to say, Trump is very unhappy with them and the high interest rates which have tripled US interest payments over the last several years. There is hope. In this video to be made soon, I will discuss how we can recover the republic intended for us by the founding fathers, how we can replace the culture of coercion with the culture of compassion. It has to do with choosing life over death, healthcare over military. The solution revolves a multi-trillion dollar, in fact, market and a new way of doing business in the digital economy. Please comment, subscribe, and share with your friends. Join me for the next video.